Welcome to another episode of Obsessed with Death. Today we have Dr. Brandy Schillace. She is a historian of medicine and the critically acclaimed author of Death's Summer Coat, Clockwork Futures, and most recently, Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher. She's been interviewed and reviewed by Science Magazine, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, all over the place, and she also hosts her own book club. You can get all of that information at brandyschillace.com. I will leave all the info in the description of the episode as well. Make sure you go check out her new book, Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher. We discuss more about the book on the episode, as well as a million other death-related things. She was an awesome guest. You couldn't ask for a better guest. We discussed Victorian era death rituals to a man trying to swap bodies and all all kinds of crazy stuff. And of course her book as well, which was one of the craziest books I've ever read in the best way possible. So thank you guys for continuing to check out the podcast. It is greatly appreciated. I hope you guys enjoy it. Please make sure you rate, review, and subscribe. I feel like I'm not going to keep doing this. I don't want to bug everybody, but I see how many people are listening and I see how many reviews and ratings we get, and they're not matching up. So please, it helps the podcast tremendously. So please, if you're on Apple Podcasting or Spotify especially, please subscribe, follow, do all the things. I really appreciate it. We're dropping this episode early because why not? You're also still going to get your every 2 week scheduled episode on Sunday. So this is early. You're getting another episode in just a few days. Thank you for listening. Let's get into the episode. Okay, bye. Basically, so this all started because I read an interview that you did for Wired about your latest book, Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher, which, I mean, as soon as I found out what that book was about, it was just, I don't think I've ever. I ordered the book. I don't think I've ever read anything like that before. The story is absolutely insane. I want to get into how you discovered this, how you wrote it. I'm interested in all of that. But before we get started with all of that, I am interested just in your feelings, your perspective. Like, how do you view death? Are you worried about it? Or do you think about it a lot? What is your relationship with death?
Well, so my first book, not this present one, but my first book several years ago was called Death's Summer Coat. And it's a cross-cultural history of death and dying and grief rituals, looking at the past, looking at other cultures to answer the question, why do we grieve the way we do now in the West? Because we're not very good at it in the United States or the United Kingdom, for that matter. We tend not to handle grief and death very well. Now, that book came out now, I think 5 or 6 years ago, but it's an evergreen topic, more especially because we're in this period of COVID where suddenly people are being forced to deal with issues of mortality in a way that they didn't have to prior. So there's been a renewed interest, I think, partly because we're quite ill-equipped to deal with death and dying. But I myself and perhaps slightly better equipped, partly from researching and writing the book and being somebody who does quite a bit of study on death, trauma, brain death, and grief rituals. But I think one of the things that's very clear to me is that we are victims of our own success in the West. We have a medical tradition that has largely screened us from the process of dying, the dyingness of dying, the embodied quality of it. And that means it tends to, you see someone kind of, they're sick and they go in the hospital and then you don't see them again sometimes until the funeral. And that dislocation means we often don't process death very well. And there's lots of people who have never actually seen someone die unless they're, an ER nurse or something, a soldier, right?
Sure.
Most people haven't had that experience. And I feel both, it's a kind of privilege. That's probably not quite the right word, but there was a lot of death and dying in my family. And I went to many, many funerals quite young. And some of them were held in a way that I don't think people typically do today, where you wash and dress the body as a family, where you have the wake, where it's a much more intimate affair. And that's how my grandfather's body was treated when he passed. And there's something intimate and close about that I got to be part of in my life. I also have witnessed death. I was actually performing CPR on someone who died. They had had a massive coronary in a diner, and I and one of the waitresses were performing CPR on him when he passed. And we knew that he was gone. We continued to do CPR, but it was strange because I knew the moment at which he was not there anymore. You could tell. And that was really impacting for me, that, death is so much nearer and more intimate and familiar. And there was a time when we all interacted with death in a much more familiar way. So it wasn't as frightening. It didn't pop up suddenly and, startle us. It didn't haunt us. It was a part of living. So there was a moment in time in our history, and still true in other cultures, where dying is part of living. And I think that's something we've lost in the West.
That's very interesting. Where do you think we lost it? What do you think happened exactly? Like, how did things change to the point where, again, like, I'm someone I've never witnessed death. I can't imagine I'm going to witness it anytime soon. Where do you think we lost that sort of tradition with death?
Well, if you look at the Victorian period for a moment, and I apologize because I do am happy to talk about other cultures because I think that's really illustrative. But for our purposes, Americans and people in Britain, we tend to look back at the Victorian period a lot for things. And there's a reason. That's when, you have the Industrial Revolution. A lot of things from that period we kind of inherited. But we haven't inherited their approach to death. So in the Victorian time, 19th century, they had levels of mourning. And if you could afford it, some of these were quite extravagant. So when someone first died, you dressed all in crepe black. Crepe black doesn't reflect light. Then as you process through grief, you would switch to like a satin black, which did reflect light. Then later you could wear gray and then blue. And then, you would travel in your clothing out of grief. More poverty-stricken people wouldn't be able to do that, but that's where the black armbands and things came from, that people would wear these to indicate that they were in a stage of grieving. And that meant when you walked down the street in Victorian Britain, just looking around, you could easily pick out who was grieving. You knew, and you might even be able to tell how long they had been grieving based on what they were wearing. So imagine what that would be like to walk around in a society where you are facing death or the death of a loved one, and you look around and you feel, without talking to anyone, a kind of communal sense that everyone else is dealing with death and dying as well. And I think that's really amazing.
Yeah, that's
They also,
beautiful.
yeah, it is. It also became commodified, as things sometimes do, and it became an industry actually of mourning wear, mourning jewelry. But also, they didn't take. It's not like now where we take pictures of our food. We've got pictures, a billion pictures of our children
Yeah.
or our parents. You might not have a photograph of your loved one. You got a marriage picture. That was like when it happened, because daguerreotypes were printed on silver backed. They were silver backed, and that's obviously quite expensive. So sometimes you would lose a child and you had no image of this child. And so they would perform post-mortem photography where they would pose the child as though it was alive and then take its photograph. And then the parent would have that photograph as a memorial. And they were called memento mori. And they would hang them in their houses. And I've seen a number of these. Some of them, it's very hard to tell who in the photo is not living. Some of them are more obvious, but there's one where it's two parents are seated and their daughter is standing behind them with her hand on either of their shoulders, and she's actually the one who is passed on in that photograph.
Wow.
They've propped her up to do that. So this was a common practice. Sounds quite morbid, but it really wasn't. It was a way of saying, I agree, I know this has happened. I want to memorialize this moment. I want to feel this, intimately. They were called funeral parlors because often it was the parlor of the home where the body was laid out in state for people to view prior to burial. So if you think about it that way, it was in your house. So it's not the Victorian period. It wasn't the Industrial Revolution itself, for instance, that brought us to a place where we were less prepared to deal with death and dying. It's really, I think, the progress of medicine. We tend not to treat the sick at home. We tend not to treat the dying at home. It does happen, but it's somewhat rare, right? Hospice has allowed that to happen more. But so if you consider that once hospitals became a place, not that you went to as a last resort, but that you went to get better, and they're very sterile and they're very clean, and largely you as the friend or relation of the patient aren't seeing the behind the curtain stuff. You're basically dislocated from all the messy body things that happen to you as you are dying. And medicine has kind of done that. And we're glad. That's good. Funeral parlors that are no longer in your house, but is an industry, and we're glad, right? I know when my grandmother died instead of my grandfather, it came as a shock, and we weren't expecting it. And actually, it was so nice to be able to call the funeral director and go, help. I don't even know who to call, and they kind of take care of it for you. And it's wonderful, but it also means none of us have that experience anymore of walking through those stages of grief. So I would say we began to lose it at the same time that we began to save lives. People get a real misimpression of life length in history because people say, oh, the average lifespan was 35. That doesn't mean that people died at 35. Most people lived into their 70s. Well, the problem is it's an average. And most people died before they were 5. You lost children in huge quantities before vaccines. And as a result of that, this is why you'd read where people had 12, 13 children, but only 4 adult children. And so if you think about how often death would have hit in your own home historically until medicine comes along, and then children live. They don't die from measles, or they don't die from these diseases. They live. They don't die from diphtheria. They don't die from polio. So once we have those things in place, then you realize that a family of 4, 2 parents and 2 kids, could literally go until their very, very aged relatives at the age of 90 die without ever seeing a funeral. And that just wasn't true historically.
Wow. Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it. And, I've never really thought about it in the sense that, obviously I've visited people in hospitals and there's been certain circumstances where there's situations like that I've been in, but it really does sort of desensitize you from the entire situation. You go to the hospital, you visit somebody, maybe you hang out in a waiting room, like you really don't experience any of the actual parts of death or what these people are going through. And sure, I mean, we need all these things. These things are great. Obviously, I want hospitals to be around, but it does sort of remove the intimacy of death between you and family and friends or whoever that is.
Well, and it allows us to perpetuate a real myth, which is we don't like to recognize how messy bodily death is. Sure. The disintegration of cellular, cohesion as we slowly, especially if someone has cancer or some other sort of wasting disease, as you're watching that, the sights, the smells, all sorts of the fluids. I mean, I know I'm not trying to be gross, but our bodies are messy. you know.
Yeah, of course.
We're
Absolutely.
messy little machines when we're babies, and
Yeah,
we're kind of messy machines again at the end. And that's hard. That's hard to face. And a lot of times
sure.
people, you'll see people withdraw from dying loved ones, and it's not because they don't love them. It's because they can't face losing, they have an image of that person in their head, and they fear having a different, worse image in their head. They don't want that to be the last thing that they see. And I think that's something that isn't just medically related. I don't think that's just medicine's doing. I think that's our cultural obsession with image,
Sure.
which, you know, we have this concept that bodies always have to be lean and toned and hard and you know,
Yeah.
and fit, and it's abled as well. It suffers from a real sense of ableism, because we're telling ourselves we only want to look at bodies that are fit and able, and we don't want to look at bodies that are messy and difficult. And that's bad for us in lots and lots of levels. It means that we don't deal with the disabled very well either.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, social media, I think in general is destroying a lot of different things. um, I'm not really a big fan. I think it's gonna be down the road eventually. We're gonna realize how dangerous and how detrimental it can really be. And like you said, it really does. It doesn't really show the truth to just about anything. Anything. And yeah, I think that's when you speak to the messiness of the body, it immediately just makes me want to discuss your book, because things got really messy. I
Yeah,
mean,
they did.
I
um yeah, like for your listeners who aren't aware, the so my first book I was mentioning is about death and dying, but this latest book, um well, I mean, it's about head transplant. I mean, let's
yeah,
just dive right in right there.
exactly. I mean, it started as head transplants. Eventually, it sort of morphed into body transplants.
Right.
But it took some work to get to that point. I'm before we get into the details, because I would like to discuss some of the details of the book. Obviously, we want people to go and read it as well, but there's just a few things I think would be interesting to discuss. But before we even get into that, how did you find this story? Like, where did this come from? How did you even get involved in something? And I know you did some traveling as well. How did this all start?
You know, my stories very often find me, and I'm not sure why this is, but it's happened on more than one occasion. I was called to a colleague's, and this again, this comes out of the first book. So while researching death and dying, I was researching how brain death operated and brain trauma, and I got to know a brain surgeon who deals a lot with trauma and brain death in his career, and I got to know him pretty well. We became good friends. One day he called me and he asked me to come down to his office. He had something he wanted to show me. And when I got there, he basically pulled out a shoebox kind of thing and took out a notebook and let me have it. And it was an old, sort of dog-eared 1950s MIT lab book. And it had been the lab book of Dr. Robert White, who ends up being the subject of my book.
Hmm,
And inside it were all of these notations, this cramped handwriting, little flecks of probably blood, that was about abstracting alive and whole the brains of mice, which is where he began.
hmm,
And this sounds peculiar, but you have to understand White was both a neurosurgeon and a neuroscientist. So, on one hand, he was performing brain surgeries, taking out tumors, saving lives. And on the other hand, he was a scientist trying to figure out how the brain operates at a time when, with the advent of organ transplant, people were really starting to get pretty fussy about having a definition of brain death, because you don't want somebody taking out your organs for a beating heart donor if you're not sufficiently dead. And they
sure.
had to know what's dead enough to donate your organs, because and I realize this is confusing for some people, but your heart can beat even when your brain has stopped working. Your lungs will stop, but if there's artificial respiration that is delivered to you by machine, your heart will keep beating. It'll do that even if your head is not there, if you're getting respiration and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
So as a result of that, they were wanting to take out hearts that were still beating, and people were saying things like, how do we know this person is really dead? How do we know that you're not murdering them when you take this organ? So that's going on. His interest in brains is partly to figure out what exactly is brain death, and maybe more importantly for White, what exactly is brain life? What's brain alive mean? And what's the fine line between those two?
He seemed like such an interesting guy. You describe him as somebody who could almost cut to someone's core just immediately, but was also somewhat kind of charming.
Yes.
I mean, it's just obviously when you hear about the type of work that he does, charming isn't necessarily the first word that would come to mind for me. He seemed like
No.
such an interesting person. What did you get to know about him while you were researching for the book?
Well, there's a reason why I chose that somewhat cheeky title of Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher. Those are his two nicknames.
Yeah.
So PETA, animal rights activists, called him Dr. Butcher.
Yeah, they must have loved him.
They did not. I actually ended up interviewing several times the Ingrid Newkirk, founder of PETA, about him, and they debated each other publicly here in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I'm from and also where he operated. Mm-hmm. And he didn't back down. He wasn't afraid, but he could absolutely cut people to the quick. And he did it sometimes publicly. Yeah. He was very charming. However, he was also Mr. Humble. But when I say Mr. Humble, I need you to understand that he gave himself that nickname. So you might want to question exactly how humble he was. But he did. He charmed people. People thought he was funny and clever, and he was a practical joker. He did some practical jokes that were a little out there, using cow brains. We can talk about that if you want. But
I would love to, yeah.
So yes, he was charming and he could eviscerate people. And I mean that in a figurative sense, but at the same time, technically, kind of. Yeah. And what he first set out to do was to prove that a brain could outlive its body. And that's, to me, I know head transplant tends to be the one that gets people to follow you out of the room and ask questions. But a brain outliving its body, that kind of does it for me. That was the peculiar piece for me. Yeah.
So you get these journals, these notebooks, and you start researching. You did some traveling as well. From what I have here, you went out to the Midwest all the way out to Russia. What was that like?
Well, so Dr. White's trajectory is he was from Minnesota. He went to the University of Minnesota. He was in the medical school. He worked at Mayo Clinic there. Then he started off in Boston, Harvard medical school there, and then ended up finishing doing his residency in Minnesota, where he was from. And along the way, he was honing his sense of what he wanted his career to be about. And so I was kind of taking little journeys to follow in those footsteps. In Harvard, he was at the Peter Bent Brigham Medical at the hospital there when the first successful kidney transplant was done by Joseph Murray. And it was done on twins because they had not yet figured out immunosuppressant drugs, so you didn't reject the kidney, but twins wouldn't reject a similar genetic material. And White was there for that as a student, and he thought, wow, if you can transplant kidneys, what else can you transplant? Then he goes to Minnesota, and there he starts working on spinal cord injury and finding out that you can hypercool a spinal cord and reduce some of the damage, and subsequently discovers that if you hypercool the brain, it's less greedy for oxygen, which might mean you could do other things. Surgeries could get more complicated. He was eventually nominated for a Nobel Prize for that, actually.
Well, I was going to say, because the spinal cord, that's something that we still use today. That's based off of what he discovered, right?
We actually still use hypothermia, therapeutic hypothermia, also for heart patients. My father had an open heart surgery, and they used it for that too. So he's there in Minnesota, gets his PhD, gets his degrees of various sorts, finishes his residency, and he wants to be both a neurosurgeon and a neuroscientist. And the one place that offered him both roles was in Cleveland, Ohio. So he comes here. Along the way, while all of this is happening, some footage gets released from the Soviet Union. And I think it's easy for us to forget in the modern times what it was like with the early days of the Iron Curtain. People didn't know what they were capable of. I mean, there was a point at which
Yeah.
the US government was worried maybe they had figured out telekinesis. I mean, we really didn't know what was possible.
Sure.
And this is not long after we dropped the atom bomb. So of course, stuff it's these are the days of magical thinking, right? So
Yeah.
the Soviet Union releases a couple of films. One is by, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but Brunyenko. And his was called the Reanimation, basically reanimating tissues. And they were showing lungs breathing on their own and hearts beating on their own and a dog head on a table that was still alive. And some of that
Wow.
stuff was not, strictly speaking, real. It was a propaganda video.
Yeah.
However, in 1958, a video comes out that is not propaganda and it is real, by a physiologist named Vladimir Demikov, who has created a surgical chimera or chimera. He's basically created a two-headed dog. He has taken the head off of one dog, head and sort of forelimbs, and surgically attached it to another larger dog so that that larger dog's heart and lungs are feeding oxygen to the other dog's head. So it's now a two-headed dog, and he parades it around on this film, and Dr. White sees it. And, you know, there's an outer space race happening because Sputnik is released and the United States is like, we can't be beat, because if your science wins, it's like your ideology wins. And Khrushchev even says something kind of like that. Khrushchev's comment about "we will bury you," what he was really saying in the I've looked up the exact transcripts, is our science, like, we're going to win because our science is ahead of yours.
Yeah.
That spurs on all kinds of peculiar experimentation. So when White says, I want to abstract a living brain and see if it's still thinking outside of its body, it probably wasn't as shocking at the time as it seems to us today.
Sure.
So that was the first thing. He wanted to basically cut a living brain. And it's easy for us to imagine a brain in space, right? It's sort of cartoonish blob. But to think about getting it out while the animal or person is still alive is a much more complicated, difficult thing to get your head around. Oh, I keep using these phrases. I don't mean them to be puns.
No, I love it. Absolutely. I mean, the idea, it's just in itself is again mind blowing a little bit here, because even back then, obviously these things are happening. He's seeing these videos, but to have the desire to think, okay, obviously now I need to try this. So how do we make this work? He obviously went through, I think it said, what, hundreds of monkeys by the end of this.
Right.
I mean, it didn't really, he didn't figure it out on the first try.
No, well, and there's different surgical protocols that he's working on. He's practicing his hypothermia techniques. He's practicing, and unfortunately, bodies and brains, they're delicate. And, you know, you try to keep all the monitoring correct. You try to make sure that the monkey's going to survive the surgery, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But I think I don't want it to be as grisly for all of you as it was for me watching the video. But, you know, essentially, he's anesthetizing a monkey and he is slowly carving away its body while subsequently plumbing in a blood supply from another monkey. So he's using another monkey as like a life support system. And he ultimately ends up with just a head. And then finally, he removes the tissues around the brain, and you just have a brain. And it's sort of sitting on a little platform being bathed in nutrients and other things. And it's hooked up to EEG, and it appears to still be thinking. It's ticking off the graph paper, just like you would expect a living creature, a living brain to do. And for White, he was like, see, the brain can outlive its body. And why was he asking that question? It's partly related to the fact that they were also asking, when is the brain dead? You know, we can't, there were, Christian Barnard in South Africa had just performed a heart transplant from a beating heart donor who'd had an aneurysm. And he took the heart of a Black man and he put it in a white person who lived 18 more months. And a lot of people, particularly in the United States, this is at the dawn of civil rights movement, were thinking, are you going to be harvesting Black bodies to save white lives? Are
Sure.
we unsafe now? What's your criteria for brain death? And they had to sit down and try and figure that out, and doctors couldn't agree. So for White, he really felt that an isoelectric or flatline EEG was proof that the brain was dead, that you were no longer there, that you had checked out. And therefore, if you create a brain that's thinking without its body, it's like you've proved the inverse. So that was partly what he was trying to do. There's other reasons to isolate the brain. They were studying how it processed medicines and all other kinds of things without the encumbering body around it. But, this is an important question to ask in the age of transplant science.
Yeah, absolutely. And eventually what was also discussed was the idea of, instead of calling it a head transplant, it was a body transplant, which I thought was super interesting, because there are these people who have no control, depending on accidents or whatever it is. They they could be quadriplegic or whatever it is, and that their organs start to fail, obviously, much quicker than an able-bodied person.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that you could swap your body out, I'm sure, intrigued some people. I would assume there was one person I remember that you spoke of, who was actually considering doing it. He ended up not
Yes.
doing it though, right?
Well, essentially, what you have, he does this brain isolation, and he can't get everyone to agree that the monkey's still in there,
Yeah.
that it's still really itself. And so he gets the idea of doing the head transplant, literally transplanting the head with the brain still in it on the body of another monkey, much the same way that the dog transplants were happening in Moscow, but more clean, I guess.
Yeah.
And to show that this is the same monkey. It wakes up, and it does. He performs a head transplant in 1970, 1971. It wakes up, it tries to bite him. It's not happy, but it's also paralyzed. You've severed it at the spinal cord.
Sure.
It lives for 9 days, and he felt that was sufficient proof that, again, his concept that the brain could live beyond the body. But he said in that moment, have I come to a place where I can transplant the human soul? And I need to pause to say Robert White was Catholic. He didn't think monkeys had souls. This is another thing he fought quite a lot with PETA about. He didn't think of the monkeys as having a kind of personhood the way a person does. And as a result, he called those head transplants. But when he began to think about humans, and because he felt that the brain and the soul were the same thing, he felt that then that's a body transplant. So it's just like getting a kidney transplant, but it's also getting kidney, lungs, heart, in the entire package coming over to that head. So you're right. He liked to use Stephen Hawking as an example. He liked to say, look, this is a brain basically being kept alive by life support. His body is not that useful. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could give him a new body? Yes, he'd still be paralyzed, but he is anyway. So exactly. Why shouldn't we do this? Incidentally, Stephen Hawking was not interested in this concept. So I just want to say that Stephen Hawking was not signing up for this.
No, I couldn't imagine.
But Craig Vidovitz was. Craig Vidovitz was a tetraplegic man who had been injured in a diving accident when he was young and was now in his 40s. And when he had been injured, he went to therapy, and he was like, okay, so help me get better. And they were like, they didn't have therapies. They didn't. Today we do, but at the time he felt written off. And so he's very inventive. He ends up designing his own wheelchair. He designs an apparatus that helps him write, even though he has almost no movement. He has a little bit of movement in his shoulders that he harnesses that. He does physical therapy. He does all of these things that he designs himself. He gets married. He has kids. He owns his own business. He travels. He has, in his mind, a completely full life.
Yeah, of course.
Of course. But his kidneys begin to fail. And when he wanted to get a kidney transplant, he was basically told he wasn't a good candidate because he was paralyzed. And he was furious. He was like, it's like you're saying my life isn't worth or valuable in the same way that an able-bodied person's life is. And I think he's not wrong. There was a sort of inherent ableism in that idea, kind of like saying, well, but you're paralyzed,
Yeah.
So he actually meets Dr. White. He speaks to Dr. White and said, this is in the 90s now, mid 90s, and says, I'm willing to try this out. And they set about developing a protocol. And I don't want to give too much away because the
No,
book
no.
will tell you, but
Yeah, please
they
read
set
the book.
about putting together a protocol that would make this possible for human beings.
It's just I try and I was with at dinner with some friends and I was trying to explain this, and one of my friends, she's got multiple dogs. She's just very, it was like I try you try and discuss this topic, and I quickly learned it wasn't dinner talk.
Well,
It's
and
such a fascinating topic though.
it is, and White, as I said, he had kind of these two sides to his personality. He was
Yeah.
a Catholic father of 10. He was well beloved in his community. He was fun. He played pranks on people. He served coffee at the local diner and pretended he worked there. There's many happy little stories about him. He was also someone who pitted himself against animal rights people and
Yeah.
had and got pretty good at using the media to kind of get his way and to manipulate situations to his benefit. When he debated Ingrid Newkirk, he stacked the audience with people that he'd performed surgeries on. So when he would start talking
Wow.
about how animal procedures help human beings, he could just have people stand up and be like, and now there's so and so. She's here
Yeah.
because of this. Um, so big personality, very big personality,
Yeah.
problematic in many ways. And yet, this is a man who was friends with two different popes, Pope Paul VI and Pope
That's
John Paul
right.
II.
That's right. I mean, yeah, please continue.
Yeah.
That's
Oh, it's crazy.
it's so
I mean,
crazy.
when someone told me like, oh yeah, I knew one of the popes, and I was like, sure he did. No, he knew two. And he was an advisor to Pope Paul II. They used to chat in the gardens of the Vatican. He helped to found the Vatican Council for Bioethics. So this is someone who was very interested in ethics,
Yeah.
who was cutting the heads off of like 300 monkeys.
He-
It's really hard to and this story, I should say, if your listeners, I hope, if they want to read a really peculiar, interesting book, the book is not about the head transplant. A head transplant
Sure.
happens in the book.
Yes.
The book's about what's the difference? Where's that fine, troubled, muddy, ephemeral line between life and death? And who gets to decide? One of the Craig Vidovitz was right to say, who gets to decide my life's not worth saving? On the other hand, many people were like, well, if you give someone a body transplant, that donor could have saved 5 people, could have saved a heart patient and a lung patient and a liver
Sure.
patient and a kidney patient. Are you saying one person's life is worth 5? So it's a difficult, complicated read that generates far more questions than it answers, but it asks us to participate because we should not abdicate the authority or responsibility about answering these questions to the powers that be. We don't really want to give, a blank check, as it were, to the government or to medical bodies. We want to be the ones asking questions about life, about death, about dignity, about social justice, about all of those things. We need to grapple with them, and we need to grapple with the very difficult concept of dying, of the fact that you can't save everybody.
Yeah. Where do you think we are in the timeline of organ farms? I feel like I've heard this like term be thrown around before, and I feel like we're getting to a point in maybe our time our time while we're still alive that could be a thing. Have you heard anything? What's your feelings on
Well,
the idea of just like an organ farm? Because
it's
we're
true
getting
that
there, right?
they're thinking about that possibly stem cells might be a way of building, of growing organs, and they have thought about that. But it's far more complicated than most people realize. One of the things that's true is that you still have to physically have an organ, and if you grow a heart in a petri dish, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a functioning organ. It's a whole complicated set of structures.
Yeah.
So one of the things they've been doing recently is another kind of chimera hybrid. It was in the news. I actually wrote an article about it, about the splice. They were sort of adding human DNA to embryos of monkeys to see if you could create a kind of hybrid that maybe down the road would allow you, they were trying this with pigs as well,
Yeah.
allow you to create organs that would be compatible with human beings. So that's one way of farming it that is almost as upsetting, maybe more upsetting than the 300 monkey heads in Dr. White's freezer, because you're basically going to farm an animal for the purposes of taking their organs.
Yeah.
Another is that the red market is still operational. I also wrote an article about that. And the red market is where it's a cash for organs scheme. It's black market, but red. And it's a traffic in bodies. Sometimes it's people who are poverty stricken selling their own extra organs, a kidney, let's say, for cash. Other times it's hospitals engaging with practices they shouldn't. There's a few that got in trouble not too long ago about that overseas.
The body brokers.
And then China was written up recently, brought up on charges for accusations anyway, were hurled in their direction that they were killing off sort of dissidents and using their organs. So religious, various other people that were imprisoned for their beliefs might in fact be harvested for organ transplant. Now, the accusations are there. I haven't, that case, as far as I know, hasn't been decided.
Sure.
But all of these things are in the news. And so I think it'd be really nice if it was sort of Cabbage Patch Dolls, right? You just had some cabbage leaves that you open up and there's a kidney in there, but it's probably going to involve bodies of some sort. And exactly what that means is harder to know. In science fiction, right, you clone bodies and you take their organs instead. And that's not as weird as, it's weird. It's not as fictional as it might seem. So, there's so much out there. And I think the problem, right, is we get to the can before we get to the should frequently. And if we're driven by a fear of dying, then what might we be willing to overlook ethically along the way? So, again, going back to that concept of my earlier book, that grappling with and becoming intimate with and familiar with death as a partner in life, basically as the other half of everything that happens, is a powerful way of keeping us from fear-driven pushes against the limits of ethical science.
Yeah, I think the issue here is that animals are just adorable. It's like, if they weren't so goddamn cute, I think a lot more people would be able to get behind this. And it's unfortunate, because you don't want to have to take another life just so that someone else could continue to live does seem unfair. But I mean, how long have we been using animals to progress in science and medicine? I mean, it's
absolutely forever. I mean, that was Dr. White's argument, is he basically said, you don't like animal experiments, okay, but if it weren't for mice, we wouldn't have vaccines. If it weren't for and when you think about that, I just told you earlier that maybe 1 in 5 children would survive their childhood at different points in time, and you realize that the vaccines we rely on also, at least some of them, had to do with animal testing.
Sure.
You can, insulin came from dog pancreases and pig pancreases, and isolating viruses often required using monkey brain tissue, and we just don't think about that. We tend to be really happy with the results, and we don't ask hard questions. And I'm not, the book is not for or against animal testing. It's very neutral in the way it's presented, but I think it's necessary to look at both sides, to look at the people going, this is crazy, you should not be doing this, nobody should perform a head transplant, how wrong, how terrible, and to look at people like Craig Vidovitz, who says, my life's worth saving. I think it's good to look at both of those sides and go, well, this is complicated, because aren't we all complicated? Isn't science and medicine messy and complicated? Dr. White was complicated. So, a lot of what, all of my books, actually, Death Summer Coat, Clockwork Futures was the one after that, which talked about dread tech, the way our technical innovations sort of incorporate their own catastrophes. And then this one is all about that give and take, and not to be a fearmonger or anything, but also, don't be afraid of pushing those limits and boundaries, but also clear-eyed, clear-sighted recognition that you need to have the ethics in place before you get to those like do or die moments where you haven't thought about it yet.
Absolutely. The book is Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher. I recommend it. It obviously, like we said, there's a lot to it. It's very interesting. I think the subject matter, hopefully through this conversation, will kind of calm people's nerves a little bit, in the fact that you're not going to have to read a book about, monkey surgery, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, maybe don't look at the pictures if you're squeamy about that. There are some photographs in there.
Or do look at the pictures. You have some up on your Instagram too that I was looking at that are, if you can handle it, I recommend it. It's wild. Those photos are incredible.
It's really interesting. And I will say too, I got to know Ingrid Newkirk quite well, the founder of PETA, through all of this. And she's also read the book. So, and in fact, it's in the library at PETA headquarters. So,
there you go. PETA recommends it.
Well, it's not a book that I don't shy away from the ugly bits of any of the things that I talk about. Yeah. Well, at the same time, recognizing that, some of these things are the only way that we've created life-saving techniques.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I really do appreciate it. I just randomly, I found your interview on Wired. I shot you an email, and you were very nice. And to chat with me for this long, I really do appreciate it. The last thing that we sort of do on the podcast, I was interviewing a funeral professional, and she was discussing all of the process of basically the funerals, and something that stuck out to me that I never really thought about was that apparently nowadays a lot of people are putting together funeral playlists where they're creating a very specific list of music to be played during these different funerals. And I found that super interesting, and I've been asking different guests, I don't need a whole playlist, but is there an artist, is there a song, or is there something that comes to mind that you would want to be played at your funeral, or whatever it is that you decide to do when it's all over?
I quite like Feather on the Clyde by Passenger, sorry. And it's a song. Passenger is a Scottish band, and it's a song that I think says a lot about our decisions, our hopes, our dreams, but also that sense that sometimes you just have to go with the flow. And so if you're not familiar, the lyrics are, there's a river that runs through Glasgow. It makes her, but it breaks her and takes her into the parks. And her current, just like my blood flows, down from the hills, round aching bones to my restless heart. Well, I would swim, but the river is so wide, and I'm scared I won't make it to the other side. Well, God knows I've failed, but he knows that I've tried. I long for something that's safe and warm, but all I have is all that is gone. I'm as helpless and as hopeless as a feather on the Clyde.
I mean, I love it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me on.